In the early 1930s, Europe watches Germany with a mixture of fear and confusion. Factories are running again. Exports are rising. Infrastructure projects stretch across the landscape. Employment numbers improve month by month. Trains move. Steel flows. Power is returning. And yet, something is missing. Germany has no money. Its foreign currency reserves are gone. Its credit is broken. Its currency is distrusted abroad. By every orthodox measure, this recovery should be impossible. No capital, no gold, no access to international finance. Still, the economy moves. The question that haunts policymakers across Europe is simple and unsettling. How is Germany paying for this? To understand the answer, we have to return to the wreckage left behind after the First World War. Germany entered the 1922 economically shattered. Reparations, obligations, drained resources. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. Confidence in the currency collapsed. By the time stability briefly returned in the late 1922s, it rested on fragile foreign loans. Then the global financial system broke. When international credit dried up during the Great Depression, Germany was hit harder than almost any other industrial nation. Capital fled. Banks failed. Unemployment soared. By 1932, millions were out of work, and the state was nearly insolvent. Foreign currency, the lifeblood of trade, was critically scarce. Germany could not import raw materials at scale. It could not pay in hard currency. It could not borrow. The traditional tools of recovery were gone. Yet political pressure to restore growth was overwhelming. The leadership that emerged in this crisis faced a brutal constraint. The economy had to expand, but money could not be used to do it. This is why the story matters. Germany did not rebuild power through wealth. It rebuilt power through control. Instead of relying on currency, it redesigned trade itself. The first step was inward. Imports were tightly rationed. Foreign exchange was centralized. Every transaction that crossed Germany's borders was scrutinized, approved, and directed by the state. Businesses no longer decided freely what to buy or sell abroad. Trade became an instrument of policy, but control alone could not solve the central problem. Germany still needed oil, food, rubber, metals. Without money, it had to offer something else in return. This is where the quiet transformation began. Germany turned to bilateral clearing agreements. On paper, they looked technical, bureaucratic, temporary. In practice, they rewired European trade. Under these agreements, Germany and a partner country would agree to trade without using hard currency. Exports and imports were recorded in special accounts. When Germany imported goods, it did not pay in cash. Instead, the value was credited to the partner's account usable only to buy German goods. No dollars, no gold, no open market exchange. Trade became closed loops. For countries struggling with their own shortages of foreign currency, this arrangement was tempting. They could sell agricultural products or raw materials to Germany without needing scarce reserves. In return, they received guaranteed access to German industrial goods. It felt like cooperation, but it came with strings. Balances could not be freely converted. Prices were set administratively. Germany often delayed settlement. Over time, partner countries accumulated credits they could only spend one way on German exports, at German terms. Money disappeared from the process. Power took its place. By the mid-1930s, these clearing agreements spread across Central and Eastern Europe. Agricultural economies became tied to German industry. Trade patterns shifted. Dependence deepened. Germany, meanwhile, conserved its precious hard currency for the few things it absolutely could not obtain otherwise. On the surface, the system worked. Factories received inputs. Farmers found buyers. Trade volumes grew. Germany appeared to be reintegrating into the European economy without paying for it in money. But this apparent stability masked a deeper fragility. The clearing system did not create wealth. It redistributed pressure. Partner countries found themselves locked into asymmetric relationships. Their exports flowed steadily to Germany, but their ability to buy elsewhere shrank. Surpluses piled up in accounts that could not be converted. Over time, frustration grew. Germany gained leverage without spending cash. This was the first major turning point. Trade ceased to be neutral exchange. It became strategic architecture. By replacing currency with controlled barter, Germany insulated itself from financial constraints, but at the cost of flexibility, trust, and long-term balance. The system depended on constant management, political pressure, and expanding control. It could grow only by pulling others deeper into its orbit, and it could survive only as long as expansion continued. What looked like ingenuity was also a trap. The clearing agreements solved the immediate problem of having no money, but they replaced it with a system that could not adjust smoothly. When conditions changed, when supplies tightened, when political tensions rose, there would be no market signals to soften the blow. The recovery was real, but it was rigid. In the next stage of this story, we'll see how this system spread, how it reshaped Europe's economic geography, and how Germany's trading partners slowly realized that prosperity without currency came at a hidden price. Because rebuilding power without money was possible, the question was how long it could last. Once the clearing system was in place, it began to expand quietly, deliberately, and with growing ambition. Germany's trade planners understood that the agreements could not remain limited experiments. For the system to work, it needed scale, more partners, more commodities, more routes that bypassed currency altogether. Each new agreement reduced the need for scarce foreign exchange and widened Germany's economic reach. The expansion followed a pattern. Countries on Germany's eastern and southeastern periphery were approached first. Many were agricultural exporters struggling with collapsing prices and limited access to international markets. Their own currencies were weak, their reserves thin. Selling to Germany under clearing arrangements offered something rare in the 1930 seconds: guaranteed demand. Grain, livestock, timber, and minerals began flowing westward. In return, German industrial goods flowed east. Machinery, chemicals, finished products. The trade volumes looked impressive on paper. Officials in partner countries could point to rising exports and stable contracts. In the short term, the system eased domestic pressures. But behind closed doors, the terms were tightening. Germany controlled the clearing accounts. It set prices. It determined delivery schedules. Payments were often delayed, rolled over, or offset against future obligations. What appeared to be balanced trade was, in practice, increasingly one-sided. Credits accumulated in accounts that could not be spent freely. For Germany, this was an advantage. For its partners, it became a constraint. As the system matured, pressure moved from markets to ministries. Trade disputes were no longer settled by prices or exchange rates, but by negotiation and leverage. Germany could threaten to reduce imports, delay settlements, or redirect contracts. Smaller economies had limited alternatives. This is where escalation began. Clearing agreements stopped being just economic tools. They became instruments of influence. Access to the German market could be expanded or withdrawn based on compliance with broader demands. Economic dependence translated into political sensitivity. At the same time, Germany intensified internal controls to keep the system functioning. Imports were prioritized ruthlessly. Foreign exchange allocations were reviewed line by line. Non-essential goods were excluded. Luxury imports vanished. Consumption was reshaped to fit strategic needs. The economy became disciplined, but also inflexible. Every ton of steel, every shipment of fuel, every crate of food was accounted for. Growth continued, but it was managed growth. The pressure this created inside Germany was real. Industrial firms operated under tight margins and strict quotas. They were guaranteed inputs, but not freedom. Profits existed, but were subordinated to national priorities. Business decisions increasingly required state approval. Yet for many firms, the arrangement was preferable to collapse. Orders were steady, labor was mobilized, capacity expanded. The clearing system insulated them from international financial volatility, even as it tied them closer to state direction. Abroad, the consequences deepened. Partner countries found their export structures narrowing. Because clearing credits could only be spent on German goods, diversification became difficult. Imports from other suppliers declined. Local industries struggled to compete with subsidized German products entering under preferential terms. Trade dependency hardened into structural imbalance. Complaints grew, but options were limited. The global economy was still weak. Alternative markets were scarce. Currency shortages were widespread. Breaking away from the German system risked losing a major buyer with no immediate replacement, so the agreements persisted. By the late 1932s, Germany's clearing network covered a wide arc of Europe. It was not an empire in the traditional sense. There were no flags raised, no formal annexations through trade. But economically, gravity was shifting. Trade flowed increasingly toward Germany, on German terms, without money changing hands. The system's success created its own momentum. As more partners joined, the network became harder to escape. Each country's dependence reinforced the next. Germany conserved its hard currency for critical imports beyond Europe, while satisfying most of its needs through controlled barter. On the surface, this looked like resilience. Underneath, pressure was rising. The clearing balances unpaid, restricted, and politically sensitive represented obligations that could not be settled normally. The longer the system ran, the larger these imbalances became. Trust depended on the assumption that the arrangement was temporary, or at least adjustable, but the system had little capacity for adjustment. Prices were fixed administratively. Exchange rates were irrelevant. There were no market signals to warn when trade relationships were becoming unsustainable. Stress accumulated invisibly. Germany's partners began to realize that prosperity under clearing was conditional. They could sell but only what Germany wanted. They could buy but only from Germany. Their economic sovereignty was narrowing quietly. Still, the machine kept running. The escalation phase did not feel like crisis. It felt like momentum. Production increased. Trade statistics improved. Germany's industrial base grew stronger, but the system now depended on constant expansion and control. Any disruption, any shortage, any refusal, any shock would reverberate across the entire network. By replacing money with managed exchange, Germany had bought time. What it had not bought was flexibility, and as the next stage unfolds, that lack of flexibility would turn a clever workaround into a dangerous liability, one that no amount of administrative control could ultimately contain. The clearing system had delivered growth. Now it began to reveal its limits. By the late 1932s, Germany's trade network was vast, intricate, and tightly managed. Goods moved without currency. Accounts balanced on paper. Production targets were met. On the surface, the system appeared stable, but stability depended on one fragile assumption, that nothing would interrupt the flow. There was no buffer. Because clearing agreements eliminated money, they also eliminated flexibility. If a shipment failed, there was no price mechanism to adjust demand. If a partner country struggled to deliver, balances could not self-correct. Every disruption became a political problem, and disruptions were increasing. Agricultural harvests varied. Transport bottlenecks emerged. Competing domestic needs in partner countries grew louder. As their populations felt shortages, governments faced pressure to divert exports away from Germany. The response from Berlin was firm. Contracts were enforced. Deliveries were demanded. Settlements were delayed. In some cases, imports were cut to punish non-compliance. Economic pressure replaced financial negotiation. This is where the system crossed a threshold. Trade was no longer mutually convenient. It was coercive. Germany's partners discovered that clearing credits once seen as security were leverage held against them. Large balances could not be redeemed freely. They could only be spent if Germany allowed it. Attempts to renegotiate terms met resistance. The illusion of partnership began to fracture. Inside Germany, the consequences were just as severe. The clearing system had prioritized strategic imports, but it had also distorted internal production. Industries focused on meeting quotas rather than responding to real demand. Substitutes replaced scarce materials. Quality declined. Maintenance was deferred. The economy functioned, but under strain. Because money was absent, inefficiencies were hidden. Losses could be absorbed temporarily. Imbalances could be administratively smoothed, but nothing was truly resolved. Each workaround increased dependence on central direction. The economy became brittle. As tensions in Europe escalated, Germany's need for raw materials intensified. Fuel, metals, food, all became more critical. Clearing agreements were stretched to their limits. Partner countries were asked to deliver more, faster, and on stricter terms. Resistance followed. Some governments quietly reduced shipments. Others sought alternative markets where possible. A few attempted to draw down their clearing credits aggressively, demanding German goods in exchange. Germany responded by tightening controls further. Imports were reprioritized again. Exports were redirected. Administrative intervention deepened. What had once been an economic workaround now required constant enforcement. This is where the breaking point emerged. The clearing system could function only in a controlled environment. It depended on predictable flows and compliant partners. As uncertainty increased, the system lost its ability to absorb shocks. There was no price signal to warn of shortages, no currency adjustment to ease pressure, no market exit that did not become a political crisis. The system was efficient at expanding under constraint but fragile under stress. Who benefited during this phase? German industry. For a time, access to guaranteed inputs without spending scarce currency allowed capacity to expand beyond what finances alone would permit. The state gained leverage across borders. Strategic autonomy appeared to increase. Who paid the price? Partner economies saw their options narrow. Farmers and exporters became dependent on a single buyer. Domestic consumers faced shortages as exports were prioritized. Economic sovereignty eroded quietly, transaction by transaction. And ultimately, Germany itself paid the price. By suppressing monetary signals and relying on administrative control, the system masked mounting inefficiencies. When pressure rose, there was no graceful way to unwind positions. Obligations piled up, frustration hardened into resistance. The clearing agreements had solved the problem of having no money. They had not solved the problem of scarcity. As Europe moved toward greater instability, the trade network that had rebuilt Germany's power began to transmit stress instead of absorbing it. Each disruption amplified the next. Control had replaced flexibility, and flexibility was now desperately needed. The system that shouldn't have worked had worked just long enough to create the conditions for its own failure. In the final stage, we'll see how this carefully managed architecture unraveled. What remained once currency and control could no longer substitute for balance, and what lasting lessons emerged from a recovery built without money. Because rebuilding power without cash is possible, sustaining it is something else entirely. When the clearing system finally began to unravel, it did not collapse in a single moment. It frayed. The trade architecture that had allowed Germany to rebuild power without money was never designed for permanence. It was designed to manage shortage, conserve currency, and buy time. By the end of the 1,930 seconds, that time was running out. The problem was not that the system stopped working overnight. It was that it stopped adapting. As pressures intensified across Europe, the clearing network lost its ability to absorb strain. Deliveries slowed. Balances grew larger and more politically sensitive. Trust eroded. Each agreement required more enforcement, more negotiation, more pressure to maintain the appearance of stability. Trade without money had replaced market risk with political risk, and political risk does not diversify. Inside Germany, the consequences became increasingly visible. Industries operated under rigid quotas that no longer matched reality. Substitutes replaced essential materials. Production targets were met on paper, but quality and efficiency declined. The economy was active, but increasingly hollow. Because prices were fixed and currency absent, warning signs were muted. Losses did not immediately register. Shortages did not trigger price adjustments. Instead, they triggered directives. The system demanded more control precisely when flexibility was needed most. Abroad, partner countries reached their limits. Agricultural economies that had depended on German demand found themselves overexposed. Their clearing credits, once viewed as assets, became trapped balances. Domestic pressure grew as populations faced shortages, while exports continued to flow outward. Some governments attempted to renegotiate. Others quietly reduced compliance. A few sought escape routes through alternative trade arrangements. Even at unfavorable terms, each deviation increased friction. Germany responded by tightening oversight, prioritizing strategic imports, and delaying settlements further. What had once been economic coordination now required constant political management. The system survived, but only through force of administration. This is the final paradox of the clearing economy. By removing money, Germany had shielded itself from financial collapse. But by removing money, it had also removed the self-correcting mechanisms that allow economies to adjust gradually. When imbalance arrived, it arrived everywhere at once. There was no clean exit. The clearing system could not be unwound smoothly. Credits could not be redeemed freely. Trade relationships could not rebalance organically. Every correction required negotiation, pressure, or confrontation. The architecture that rebuilt Germany's power now transmitted stress across the entire network. What remained when the system reached its limits was not stability but exposure. Germany had rebuilt industrial capacity, infrastructure, and leverage. But it had done so on foundations that depended on constant expansion and compliance. When expansion slowed, the system hardened instead of bending. The result was not immediate economic collapse, but strategic vulnerability. Trade partners were resentful. Supplies were uncertain. Administrative control was stretched thin. The economy was functioning but increasingly dependent on coercion rather than exchange. This is the lasting lesson. Germany's recovery without money was real. It demonstrated that power can be rebuilt through control, coordination, and alternative systems of exchange. Currency is not the only mechanism that moves goods, but the story also shows the cost of suppressing markets rather than adapting them. Money does more than facilitate trade. It transmits information. It signals scarcity. It absorbs shock. By replacing money with managed barter, Germany gained time but lost resilience. The system worked only as long as conditions remained predictable. When uncertainty increased, rigidity became a liability. In the end, rebuilding power without money proved possible. Sustaining it without flexibility did not. The clearing agreements were not merely a workaround for financial weakness. They were a warning about what happens when economic systems are redesigned to ignore balance in favor of control. They show how recovery can be engineered and how engineering can conceal fragility. Because the most dangerous economic failures are not those that collapse immediately. They are the ones that function just well enough to make their limits invisible until adjustment is no longer a choice.